Let me backtrack a little bit to answer that question and go back to the last 20 years of business education. Now we focus on business education. I keep on saying that between the late 80s and 2008, put it that way, business schools all over the world have had a ball. Nothing could go wrong for them. For many reasons, but probably the most important one is that we have seen in the 80s, in many countries, but perhaps the most visible with Margaret Thatcher in the UK and Ronald Reagan in the United States, a sort of a transformation of society whereby business became more important and actually where business was actually seen as the leader in society. I'm old enough to have studied in the 70s of the previous century, and I remember that in those days, business was not that good. My own family, my own father, when I told him that I was going to study business, looked quite worried. And he was a civil servant and thought that he was convinced that a service for government was actually what one needed to do. And going into business or studying business was sort of seen or looked upon with a sort of hesitation. So we've seen this major transformation in the 80s whereby society as a whole, and again I put this black and white, but society as a whole had a lot more belief in what business could achieve, believed very strongly in entrepreneurship, saw business as a role model, and was in many cases saying the way we organize government should be similar to the way businesses are organized, with objectives and key performance indicators, and sort of the way you organize government and the way you organize society can learn from how business is organized. So it became natural that business schools were good for you, and that the best and the brightest wanted to go and study in business schools, and that business schools could charge almost anything as tuition fee, because it was almost sure for people who would graduate out of a good MBA program that they would have the right return on investment. We have had a ball. This has changed over the last 2-3 years, I think, precisely because of the financial crisis and some of the excesses that we've seen in business. And perhaps because not all of the ideas that came out of business worked so well in government. And I lived the last 4 years in the UK, and I've seen what Tony Blair has, and then his successor, have tried to do in the government. And maybe not everything that they tried to do in terms of having a business orientation in government has worked that well. But it's clear that the financial crisis has put some question marks around the value of business for society. And today we need to much more justify the role of business in society. For business schools, that means that quite a few people have actually asked questions about business schools and the role of business schools. And how come that business schools were seen as being the training ground for the elite then produces people who seem to get victims of these excesses and do things that you shouldn't do, etc. There have been a number of questions there. But I think equally important is that because we were so successful as business schools, we isolated ourselves. We thought that we knew what society needed. And thus, we define business as a combination of marketing and operations and finance and accounting and a bit of strategy and whatever, and say, this is what business needs to know and this is what society needs to know. And I think business schools have in general not listened enough to what society really needs, or even what businesses need. And that's the reason why I sort of use this phrase, we need to move from being a business school to a school for business. And what I mean by a school for business is listen much more carefully to what society needs, what organizations need, and try to come up with solutions. Even if these solutions are not in the traditional disciplines of a business school. And I take an example which I only know from the press, so I have no insight or privileged insights in it, but when we take the example of the major oil spill of BP in the Gulf of Mexico, it was interesting for me to see how BP originally defined it as a technical problem. We can't stop the well. And didn't see that it actually at the same time was a societal problem, an environmental problem, a big PR issue. It was actually a relationship of a British company. It was interesting to see how BP suddenly was called British Petroleum again. So they had a geopolitical issue in the United States. And then it was actually a much more complex issue, and that the solution for that problem, which is a very difficult one, and I'm not saying that I have a solution for it or that I would have been better at managing it, but it was clear that the solution, the leadership that was required to manage that problem needed to find ideas in sociology, in political science, yes, in the technology, but also in pure management and leadership, that it actually needed to have components of solutions that would fit together, that could be assembled together, and that in terms of where it had to come from, went much beyond what a traditional business school is doing. Now that's where SMU is sitting in a great place, because we have actually many of the building blocks that are needed to respond to issues around energy, sustainability, global warming, diversity in the workforce, or all kinds of other issues that organizations are confronted with. By the combination of social sciences, economics, information systems, pure business, management and accounting and law, yes, we have actually many building blocks whereby if we listen carefully to society, we can come up with integrated solutions. And that's the reason why, if you would look at some of the early speeches and early interviews I gave as a president, I have been hammering on interdisciplinary efforts. I always be careful. I believe in disciplinary research, and I believe that you can do very good research based in the disciplines. But there is a lot of value in bringing these building blocks together and providing answers to society that recognize the complexity of the problems and don't try to bring it back to one single item of what we have to offer. So SMU is uniquely well positioned, if we can keep that integration between the schools that we have, to be a leading institution in the world. And that brings me back to an earlier question that you had about the change in educational scene here in Singapore. I think we are at a watershed, and it's a bit of an easy word to use, but until now, the Singapore educational institutions could learn from their counterparts elsewhere in the world. They were, I've sometimes used the word apprentice of what was happening elsewhere in the world. And it's clear, for example, that SMU has learned a lot from Wharton, and that we're still learning a lot from CMU, from Carnegie Mellon in information systems. At the same time, I also see that NUS has learned a lot from MIT, from its collaborations with other institutions, and I could go on like that. We have been, when I talk about SMU, and I will limit it to that, we've been an apprentice. But we've learned a lot, and there is a moment where you have to take your responsibility and say, we've now become a partner that actually can contribute to others in the world. And that is actually a subtle but very important change in the educational environment here in Singapore. That is that we've become partners for the rest of the world, partners for some of the best institutions in the world, and we will have to develop together what the university of tomorrow is. And that's where my from business school to school for business comes in. I think a new view on what a business school can be, a new view on how you respond to the challenges and the questions that society has, and how we as educational institutions, higher educational institutions and universities react to it. We actually are we have become a little bit a university that is in the driver's seat, that has to come up with its own ideas.